Hey, welcome back to The Wealth of Nations. This is Chapter 10 of Wages and Profit in the Different Employments of Labor and Stock. In part 1 of this chapter, Adam Smith looks closer at why different employments have different wages. The general idea here is that the forces of competition change wages in a way to create a degree of equality between different employments. Wages will rise and fall according to advantages and disadvantages in different kinds of employments. Imagine a really disadvantageous employment for factors other than wages. It would attract basically nobody unless they got a little increase in wages. And that little increase in wages makes that disadvantageous job a little more equal to an advantageous job with lower wages. But what do I mean by advantages and disadvantages anyway? Well, these can be split up into 5 categories. The first is the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employment. Think of disgusting, dirty jobs. If the job requires dealing with trash or waste all day, chances are you're going to want a little more money to do it. Also, having a social stigma tied to the job would count as a disagreeableness. He gives the example of running an inn. While inns are often the locations of many socially stigmatized events, the inn runners make quite a good profit off their limited stock. The second component is the level of difficulty in learning that trade. Spending the time and money necessary, a disadvantage, to gain education and experience will typically be rewarded by a higher wage. Otherwise, people wouldn't spend the time and money necessary to gain these skills. We can expect that their future wages will encapsulate the whole cost of the education and experience, plus some ordinary profit. Number 3, consistency and inconsistency of employment within the trade. If not constantly employed, what a person earns while employed must sustain them even during the periods they're not employed. Inconsistent employment, a disadvantage, a higher wage. Number 4, the level of trust given to those who exercise this trade. For example, we trust physicians with our health and lawyers with things like our life, reputations, and freedom. They bear a significant burden and therefore we're going to pay them more money. And finally, 5 is the probability or improbability of success. In a profession where 20 fail for one that succeeds, the one ought to gain all that should have been gained by the unsuccessful 20. So with sincerest apologies to all you hardworking actors out there, this man has your money. So now Smith goes on to describe how people are still willing to flock towards employments that have very low rates of success due to the natural human tendency to overestimate our own abilities and our own likelihood for success. Here's a picture of me as a film major, but that's not relevant to this chapter. And this tendency for people to overestimate their chances for success is demonstrated by the universal success of lotteries. Additionally, there's something to be said of our ideas of genius and rewards of status given to those who are able to succeed in a difficult field. Rewards of status can also make up part of the compensation of soldiers. The job of a soldier is both strenuous and has a high risk, and yet they would not be compensated more than the common laborer, at least at the time that Adam Smith was writing. This is because ideas of patriotism as well as potential for heroism would play as part of their compensation. Additionally, ideas of adventure appear to play a role in lowering wages in areas where there's higher danger and risk for bankruptcy. Now, in addition to our tendency to overestimate our own abilities, humans also have the tendency to underestimate our chances of loss. This behavior is demonstrated by our reluctance to purchase insurance. When purchasing insurance, people will often be more influenced by how much they like the event than the likelihood that event will occur. I would really hate if my house burned down, and therefore I will never purchase fire insurance. Now, of these 5 things we just described that will influence wages, only 2 of them will also influence profits. And those are the agreeable or disagreeableness of a business and the security with which it is intended. For example, if a business takes care of a really unpleasant task that's needed done by society, they are more likely to get more profit. And if a business takes more risk with its stock, it is more likely to yield more profit when successful. The next point is that of these 5 factors, although they create inequality of wages, they do not create advantages or disadvantages in the employment of either. In other words, labor will still flow to different industries as needed. But there are 3 prerequisites needed in the economy for this to be the case. Number 1, the employments must be well known and long established. This is because in newly emerging industries, things like wages will often follow abnormal patterns, as we discussed in Chapter 9. The second thing is that the industry must be in its ordinary, natural state of things. Major things happening in the country or the economy at that time may cause the flows of labor and wages to become a little off. Number 3 is that those positions must be the sole employment of those who occupy them. Assuming these 3 prerequisites, the flow of labor should establish the kind of equality that Smith is talking about at the beginning of the chapter. But this isn't really happening, which brings us to part 2, inequalities occasioned by the policy of Europe. In this section, Smith argues that the policy of Europe is a major contributor to the inequalities between different kinds of employments. 1. Limiting the number of competitors in a certain employment to less than there would have been in the natural state of things. Point 2 is unnaturally increasing competition in certain employments. And finally, number 3, by obstructing the flow of labor and stock both from employment to employment and from place to place. So as we analyze these 3 things, we'll see that they cause problems in the economy by creating inequality of the advantages and disadvantages of different employments. So let's look at number 1, by limiting competition. A common method of limiting competition is by requiring apprenticeships in order to enter certain trades. These legal requirements often limit the number of apprentices that a tradesman is allowed to take on and establishes a certain number of years that people are required to carry on those apprenticeships. As a result, the number of people able to work in these trades is far less than it would be if the government had not implemented these restrictions. Smith argues that these long apprenticeships, which were about 7 years in England, had a damaging effect on young people. This is because such a long apprenticeship is pretty unnecessary for the trades, and therefore the young people spent a long time in idleness. Additionally, the long delay in compensation caused people to develop an aversion to work in general. The purpose of these barriers is ultimately to lower competition in a way that raises wages of those who are able to make it through the apprenticeships. And this phenomenon is also similar to licensing requirements that we see today. Smith also adds that barriers to entry will be more likely to occur in the larger towns than in the countryside. This is because the close proximity of the workers in the town allows them to organize more easily than those in the country. And this is just yet another factor that raises wages in the town unnaturally above those in the country. And this bothers Smith because many of the employments of those in the country are actually a higher skill level than those in the town, despite the ones in the town receiving higher wages. Additionally, more inequality is created between the town and the countryside through the trade between them. The country will often supply the town with more basic materials, and the town will reimburse them with the manufactured products, as well as the basic materials and manufactured goods that the town is able to import from foreign countries and distant parts of the same country. However, European policy will often implement high tariffs on the importation of foreign goods. Increasing the prices of foreign goods allows the domestic producers to also raise their prices without fear of being undercut by their domestic competitors. But these increases in prices mainly comes at the expense of those in the country. Branching off this, Smith adds his disdain for people organizing within the same trade, which is more likely to occur in the cities. This is because it will warp natural competition, excluding people from the industry, raising wages unnaturally in particular areas, and preventing the free flow of labor to various industries in the economy. The pretense that corporations, and corporations being the organization of people within the same industries, are necessary for the better government of the trade is without any foundation. The real and effectual discipline, which is exercised over a workman, is not that of his corporation, but that of his customers. It is the fear of losing their employment which restrains his frauds and corrects his negligence. An exclusive corporation necessarily weakens the force of this discipline. Now let's look at unnaturally increasing competition within certain trades. Governments can unnaturally increase competition by making it easier to enter or carry on in that industry than it otherwise would have been. For this, Smith describes how most Christian countries in Europe will pay for the education of priests. As a result of the inevitable overabundance of priests that follows, priests are forced to take wages that are far, far below what a rigorous education like that would normally entail. And he says if the government were to start paying for the education of people like doctors and lawyers, their wages would be driven so far down so as to completely eliminate the reward of having spent so much time educating themselves. But perhaps things are not all bad. They can drive down the wages of certain employments that do a great deal of public good. As a result, that public good becomes more accessible to a larger part of the population. And finally, Smith criticizes the government interfering with the natural circulation of stock and labor. European policy interfering with the natural circulation of labor and stock occurred both between industry and industry and location at this time. and the organizations within industries will sometimes obstruct the flow of stock between locations. Think about the inequalities described between the town and the countryside. Obstructing the free flow of labor will also contribute to obstructing the free flow of stock. This is because stock will be employed in different industries, largely dependent on the amount of labor that can be employed in different industries. Now that labor is not flowing naturally between different industries, neither will stock. And this becomes a problem simply because it's inefficient. Another obstruction to the free flow of labor Smith describes is through poor laws which existed at this time in England. These laws required people to remain in certain areas in order to receive assistance from the government. However, restricting people to one area prevents the circulation of labor and can prevent them from finding a job. And this can also contribute to poverty, which totally contradicts the intention of these policies. Smith concludes this chapter by adding that laws to raise wages have been around for quite a while, but they've been especially misused as of late. He quotes a guy named Dr. Burns by saying, "For if all persons in the same kind of work were to receive equal wages, there would be no emulation and no room left for industry or ingenuity." Alright, that's everything for chapter 10. Thanks for watching.